With Monster Hunter Wilds releasing soon, as well as the second beta coming out, as well as the benchmark, I thought it was a good time to have a look at the performance of the game. Let's go ahead and have a look at how Monster Hunter Wilds performs. For system specs, we have a pretty simple setup here. So we have the AMD Ryzen 5 5700 X3D. I have it stock. I have a Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 on top of it. For cooling, for the GPU, we have the Zotac RTX 3070. It's an 8GB card. The game is installed on my Samsung 870 EVO. The RAM is 32GB of Patriot Viper CL18 DDR4 4000. We're using a 750W power supply. We're running all of the tests on Windows 10 and we're using the latest NVIDIA drivers that dropped on January 30th of 2025. I will only be benchmarking the middle part of the benchmark, so from when we start on that cliff to when we get to the end of the village. So I'm not benchmarking the first scene where there's the desert and he's saving the child, nor am I benchmarking the last part where's the food, just the middle part, as I thought that is the most relevant for the benchmark. Please keep in mind that this game literally has no fight scenes in this entire benchmark, and there's quite a lot of cutscenes, so please keep that in mind. In terms of the actual benchmark results, all of the runs will be on a 3-run average. So for example, at 1080p Ultra, we will run it 3 times, and that goes for all of these settings. It will be tested in full screen or the borderless mode. NVIDIA reflex will be off, VSync is off, frame rate is uncapped, ray tracing is on only when specified, DLSS or FSR upscaling is only on when specified, rebar will be on. I will be testing 1080p and 1440p. I will be testing ultra, high, medium, and low. From what I could tell, the lowest setting didn't exactly seem most relevant, so I've just left that in for the visual comparisons only. I will also be testing ray tracing, upscaling with DLSS and FSR, as well as FSR frame generation. In terms of the visual comparisons, I will only be recording and comparing in 1440p. Let's have a look at some of the recommended system specs for Monster Hunter Wilds. Now this isn't in particular for the benchmark that I'm using, but it is for the actual release game. This is what they've put on their website for the Steam recommended system requirements. So we can see here the minimum required specs is something like an i5 10400, an i3 12100, or Ryzen 5 3600. 16GB of RAM, something like a GTX 1660, so something with 6GB of VRAM or more is required, and 75GB of storage. Now it says here that an SSD is required, so it does make sense because some of the loading parts of this game will take a while if you're on a hard drive. So on the minimum, you'll expect something like 30 FPS on 1080p. The recommended specs, something again, about i5 10400, but instead we're moving up to something like a RTX 2060 Super or a RX 6600, so something a little bit newer, and 8GB of VRAM or more required. For high settings, same CPUs again, but we've increased our graphics card, so 4060 Ti, something like what I have, an RTX 3070 or an RX 6700 XT. So again, more than 8GB of VRAM is required. On ultra settings, we've increase the CPU, of course, because we're going to higher end GPUs, so something like a i5 11600K, i5 12400, the Ryzen 7 7700, and we're moving up to high tiers of graphics cards, so an RTX 4070 Ti or above, or 7800 XT. So 12GB of VRAM required, which makes sense. It's pretty hard to run this game on Ultra 4K, so you can see here. So you will also need 16GB of more when you are enabling a high resolution texture pack, and 150GB of storage on your SSD. So that's a little bit of a step up compared to the other 3, but I guess Ultra makes sense. This game is not exactly the easiest to run. Yeah, that would be pretty difficult. And as we can see here, just for mention as well, on the high settings, we're at 1440p, so that it seems about right. Scaling up. So now let's have a look at some of the actual results from the benchmarks that I did. I'll be doing a comparison between the low, medium, high, and ultra settings at each of the resolutions, so 1080p versus 1440p. Let's start off with the low settings, and the game achieved an average FPS of 72.13 at 1080p, and it was 59.13 at 1440p. This was a 18.02% difference between the two resolutions, and the 1% lows was 52.60 at 1080p and 43.33 at 1440p, which was a 9.27 FPS difference. Not too bad of a difference between the 1080p and 1440p results. Medium settings got us 63.37 FPS on average at 1080p and 50.33 FPS on average at 1440p. This was a difference of FPS of 13.04, and our 1% lows were a little bit about the same as well, a bit of a same percentage difference at 46.13 on 1% lows for 1080p and 37.27 at 1440p. This was a 19.21% difference. So scales slightly similar on average FPS and 1% lows between 1080p and 1440p, which is a little bit of an increase compared to the low settings. On high settings, we had a 20.25% difference between 1080p and 1440p on average FPS, and our 1% lows had a 19.12% difference between 1080p and 1440p. So it's a little bit similar to medium settings as well. We also had pretty much a 20% difference between the average FPS and the 1% lows, so it's scaling pretty well here, I guess, so between the 1080p and 1440p results. Now on the ultra settings, we have a little bit of an interesting case here. So we are pretty much very GPU limited at the ultra settings. I mean, high we are as well, but ultra settings really shows this off. So on the 1080p average FPS result, we got 51.63, and on 1440p we got a 41.63 result on average FPS. Now this was a percentage difference of 19.37%, so kind of similar to the other two results at medium and high, but our 1% lows are actually very similar. So at 1080p we got 20.37, and on the 1440p result we got 21.23. So this was actually a 4.22% difference. So a bit interesting here that 1440p was slightly better. So we can definitely say with the hardware that I have, the 1% lows were really pushing it to its max here at ultra settings, despite the resolution change, and there was a difference in average FPS, but their 1% lows were very similar at both of these resolutions on ultra settings. These are all of the 1080p results, so low, medium, high, and ultra. So the DLSS and FSR settings, I only put them at 1440p because I found it a little bit more relevant there. And let's get started with these results. So low versus medium, let's start off with that first. The percentage difference between the two was 12.14% on average FPS, and the 1% lows percentage difference was 12.30. Now this was a actual FPS difference on average FPS of 8.76 in favor of the low settings, and 6.47 FPS in favor of the low settings. Now medium didn't perform too bad here, but we will do a visual comparison later. At least you can play the game on low settings, although it does lag in some sections on that benchmark. It's okay for this result. We can see medium versus high here. We got 63.37 for average FPS, and we got 46.13 for 1% lows on medium, and on the high settings we got 59.60 for average FPS, and the 1% lows were 42.20. Now this was a percentage difference of 5.95% on average FPS, and a difference of 8.52% on 1% lows. So again, not too bad here, a very subtle difference between the medium and high settings in terms of performance, which is good to see, and you get a slight increase in terms of visuals in the high setting compared to the medium, which is good, and a slight decrease in performance. On the high versus ultra settings, we have a slightly different story compared to the other ones, with the ultra settings getting 51.63 average FPS and 1% lows being 20.37, which is a bit painful. Now you can see here the percentage difference on average FPS was 13.37%, so not too bad, But the big one here was the percentage difference in 1% lows. That's 51.73%. That's quite a lot here. You can see it's literally halved when we go from high to ultra. So yeah, the RTX 3070 here is really struggling in the ultra settings. It honestly didn't play that nicely when I was watching it on the screen and even recording it. You guys will see it in a bit. Yeah, I didn't really like it that much in terms of performance. So not that great. I think the settings that suit the RTX 3070 a little bit better is between that high and medium settings, and if you want to turn on DLSS on as well or some sort of FSR upscaling, it's quite good, as I'll show you guys in a bit on 1440p as well. So I'm pretty happy with these results, and they are interesting, although the game is a bit hard to run. As you guys saw, we're around about 60 FPS on this card, so it's okay. And let's head on to the 1440p results. At 1440p, I have the DLSS and FSR settings, as I found it a little bit more relevant at the higher GPU limited resolution of 1440p compared to 1080p. And as you can see here, our low versus medium settings was a bit interesting here at 1440p, a bit more of a difference than at 1080p. So we have a 14.88% percentage difference between the two graphics settings on average FPS, and at the 1% lows we had a 13.99 percentage difference between the two graphics settings. That's a little bit of a drop off between the low and medium settings. It's a 8.8 FPS loss when you go from low to medium on the average FPS, and a 6.06 FPS loss when you go from low to medium as well. So not exactly the best, but I guess it makes sense when we're scaling on this on graphics settings at 1440p, as it is pretty much GPU limited for us because the RTX 3070 literally can't pump out any more numbers than this. But yeah, interesting results here, and let's head on to our next one, which is medium versus high. For medium versus high, we can see that the FPS on average dropped from 50.33 to 47.53. This was a 5.56% percentage drop. The 1% low saw a 8.42 percentage difference between the medium and high settings. Again, not too much of a difference between medium and high here, which is good to see, considering that we get a slightly better visual at high settings compared to medium. Going from high to ultra settings at 1440p on the RTX 3070 resulted in a decent FPS drop, unfortunately. So we went from 47.53 FPS to 41.63 on average FPS from high to ultra settings. This was a 12.41 percentage difference. The 1% lows experienced quite a large percentage difference at 37.8%, which is pretty big, and a 12.9 FPS drop in 1% lows. So a little bit disappointing, but the ultra settings are a little bit difficult to run at 1440p for the RTX 3070 here, pretty much reaching the limit of what we can do. Lastly, we have the DLSS versus FSR settings. So this doesn't have frame generation on, it's just DLSS versus FSR, so just upscaling. We find that DLSS is only slightly better than FSR at 61.30 on average FPS compared to 59.07 FPS at average FPS. So this was only a 3.78 percentage difference, and the 1% lows was only a 2.55 percentage difference. So only a difference of 1.13 FPS on 1% lows. Now you can see either way, if you want to go the FSR route or if you want to go with the DLSS, you're good to go. I mean, not too much of a difference here on both the quality settings for these upscaling methods. Now, in terms of visual quality, I'll go over that as well in the visual section, but in terms of actual performance, you're pretty much even on both of them at 1440p. We'll be having a look at the ray tracing results now. So all of them are in 1440p done at high settings. Now I have a few different settings that I've done here. So I've done the DLSS off with the ray tracing on high, FSR on with frame gen and the quality is at 50, and then we have DLSS on with the quality at 50. And just for reference, just the high settings with no ray tracing, I just wanted to pop it on the graph. So as we can see here, the highest performing one is frame gen with the FSR with the ray tracing quality on, so we achieved 92.13 for average FPS and 68.87 for 1% lows. This is obviously the highest here, and then the next highest is from the DLSS quality settings, which for average FPS we got 60.83, and For 1% lows, we got 41.70. So on average FPS, this was a difference of 31.30, and on 1% lows, it was a difference of 27.17 FPS. So as we can see here, there's a significant improvement when we go from normal DLSS to with FrameGen on FSR. So FSR with FrameGen doesn't exactly look the best, but I will go over that in the quality settings, so not to worry. But let's go ahead and compare the other ones. So turning on DLSS with the quality 50 had a solid performance uplift compared to when it was off. So we went on average FPS from 39.33 to 60.83, which is a 54.67% difference. The 1% lows also saw a pretty significant boost, which is really good, going from 22 FPS to 41.70. So a clear improvement here, and DLSS definitely helps us, especially at 1440p when we are GPU limited. If you have a look at the bottom two results, so DLSS on and the normal high settings without ray tracing, you actually find that the ray trace result with DLSS performed better than when we were just on the high settings without ray tracing. So I think it shows that upscaling is very important in this game to get higher frame rates, especially at higher resolutions here. So as you can see here, between the average FPS, there was a difference of 13.30 FPS and a difference of 7.57 FPS at 1% lows. So definitely a case for upscaling here, which is kind of interesting. Pretty happy with the ray trace results here, although it's pretty clear that you do need some sort of upscaling for higher FPS. And the RTX 3070 has never really been that great at ray tracing in any case, so not too. We're gonna have a look at some of the FrameGen results as well. So there's quite a few here to go over, so we'll get straight into it. So all of the settings here are done on 1440p, and we have the ultra, high, and medium presets, and then we have them with the FSR FrameGen on, and we're going to compare it to when it's off. Let's start off with the medium settings. So medium on normal versus the medium FSR FrameGen. So on the medium preset, we got 50.33 for average FPS and 1% lows with 37.27. And average FPS on the FrameGen version was 98.80. And the 1% lows with 76.17. So you can see this is a percentage difference on average FPS of 96.3%, and this was a percentage difference of 104.4%. Pretty good on the medium settings. On high settings, it's good to see that this is scaling pretty well from the FrameGen. So we have a 95.7% percentage difference between the normal high preset and the FrameGen version of it. For the 1% lows, it's 104.7%. So clearly that's an improvement there, but in terms of actual quality that you're seeing on the screen, it's a different story, which I will go over after. On ultra settings, this is the only one not fitting the trend here, so we got 41.63 on average FPS for the normal preset, and then when we turn on FrameGen, we get 69.73 for average FPS. Now you can see the 1% lows were actually better on the normal ultra preset, so a difference of just 2.33 FPS. So yeah, I mean, not too much of a difference there, but we did get a massive bump in average FPS. Just for a reference comparison as well, I just wanted to put the ray trace DLSS result as well as the 1440p FSR medium setting result here, just for reference in comparison to all the others. So you can see here that in all instances, upscaling is better than not having it on, so having even DLSS or FSR is good. And as you guys probably saw before, FSR and DLSS perform pretty similarly in this game. And I felt the benchmark felt a lot better when the frame rates were higher, although in some scenarios when FrameGen was on, I could tell it was not that great quality, but we'll do the visual comparison in just a bit. But yeah, not too bad for all of the FrameGen results. I'm quite happy with them, but we'll go over what they actually look like now. Having a quick look at VRAM usage, I found this one a little bit interesting because I am on an 8GB card. So as we can see here on the ultra settings, when we were at 1080p with no upscaling, we were at 91.31% usage, and on 1440p we were at 92.53. This is only a small difference and makes sense. I find it quite interesting how at 1080p and 1440p we're using so much VRAM. Even though we should be more limited at 1440p, it goes to show that on ultra settings there are a lot of resources being used. At high settings, the difference between 1080p and 1440p is 4.43, so smaller than it is at ultra. On medium settings, it is 1.61, and the biggest difference here between the 1080p and 1440p results is the low settings at 7.94. It's also interesting that on the high settings with ray tracing on, no upscaling, we're using a similar amount of VRAM to ultra, no upscaling on both the 1080p or the 1440p one. Now at the same time, we can also see that the highest result in terms of VRAM usage is from ultra with the FSR and the frame gen on at the same time. So it seems to me that no matter if you have DLSS or FSR or frame gen on, as long as your graphic settings are higher, you should be using more VRAM in this game. Now you can see it wasn't too much of an issue for the RTX 3070 at below ultra settings, but on ultra I did find a little bit of stutter, and this could be due to the VRAM usage. Just to note as well, except for the low settings which had 96% GPU utilization, all of the other settings were around about 98 to 99% on the RTX 3070 if it was at 1080p or 1440p. Now for the visual comparisons. I have 3 screenshots to show you guys from each of the settings. In terms of frame generation and the upscaling from DLSS and FSR, I'm going to show you guys that one in a actual visual video comparison instead of these screenshots because it's a bit hard to see in the screenshot. So let's head on to our first one. At ultra versus high, face textures are quite similar with not much blurring from either one. The clothes that they are wearing are slightly clearer at the ultra settings than the high settings. Looking to the landscape, I couldn't really tell much of a difference in terms of quality. They look the same to me. Same goes for the monster in the water, very similar on both ultra and high. On medium versus high, on the face, the shadows feel a bit stronger at high settings, and the same thing goes with the clothes texture being a bit clearer on high settings. The landscape looks similar to me again, which is funny as the textures again are pretty similar. The monster has a negligible difference from medium to high settings in this instance. The difference at medium versus low for the face is more pronounced, with the freckles on the face being more blurred or pixelated at the low setting. The clothes are more blurry on low settings, and interestingly the shadows on the guy's face are darker on medium, and the texture on his face is smoother. This is the first instance where the landscape is a bit different. The bird or the monster that's here has its tail not rendered very well, so it's kind of less accurate and shows less anti-aliasing, as well as the rocks having less shadows. In the background, the mountains have less anti-aliasing, so more jagged edges. The monster has slightly less shadows and lighting on the monster's face. There are more reflections on the water at medium settings compared to the low settings here. For low versus lowest, the shadows on the face are slightly more blurry, but very similar overall even with the textures on the clothes. For the scenery, I can't really tell a difference between low and lowest here. If I'm nitpicking on the monster scene with the water, there's only a slight difference on the shadow rendering on the water, but it's a bit blurry on the lowest settings. For the still shots, this will be my last comparison, which is ray trace high versus normal high without upscaling. In terms of the face, the lighting on the lips feels a little bit more natural. The mustache on the guy's face is a bit more full on the ray trace result compared to the normal high settings. In the scenery, it's subtle, but the textures on the little thing riding behind you are a bit better, and the tail on the monster looks more natural on the ray trace setting. Oddly enough, there is more mountain on the ray trace result, but I'm not sure what's up with that. The monster scene is more obvious. The water shadows and lighting are way more apparent. The monster has more shadows on him, and it feels like everything else is pretty similar. With upscaling, let's have a look at the actual footage, as I feel this will be a better representation for it. I'll also have some more comparisons between all of the settings that I just stated here in divvied up sections on the screen, and I'll be playing them as they go, so you probably won't hear my commentary the whole time. probably scrolling through them right now. But if you guys also want to see the actual footage, I will have them uploaded eventually because I really need to get this video out soon. So let's have a look at some of the upscaling visual quality differences. So for the first one, on the left we have DLSS on medium, and on the right we have FSR on medium. Both are on quality 50. From reviewing the footage, I really couldn't tell too much of a difference between the two in terms of the upscaling methods of DLSS and FSR. In terms of performance, they are pretty much comparable to each other, and visual quality looks very similar as far as I can tell, so you're good to go on either one if you prefer FSR or DLSS. Next we have up is the high settings with the high ray tracing with no DLSS versus the DLSS version of it. So when comparing the ray tracing one to the DLSS version, I honestly again couldn't see too much of a visual impact on quality. Sometimes there are really minor visual bugs with DLSS, like here or here, but generally it's fine as a whole. Since DLSS and FSR basically look similar, and DLSS looks similar to when there is no upscaling, let's compare DLSS to FSR with frame generation enabled. I can see with frame generation enabled, the textures are lowered in some areas, which helps with the higher frame rate. To me, that is noticeable. Even with the textures on the monster in the first scene, they're slightly lowered. You can see when running through the grass here, there's a bit of an odd texture when the frame generation is on, and this theme kind of continues with frame generation. So I'll go through two more examples comparing frame generation. Since we did it with the high comparison on ray tracing, let's do it on ultra and medium. First with ultra on no DLSS versus the frame generation. Here, when the man is jumping on the monsters, the textures are a bit lower. If you have a look at the shadows, they're spazzing out a little bit. There is also a problem with textures going all over the place, which could be due to my RTX 3070 not handling well at 1440p Ultra. The clarity in the water is not as great as the normal Ultra settings here, and it's a bit blurry with the monster water scene. You can see the shadows feel like they're lagging a little bit here when running on the monster. Lastly, we have medium with no upscaling versus the frame generation version with FSR. Similar thing happens with the shadows here on the monster, and it looks a bit odd. Some of the textures have weird artifacting on them, at least on the first scene, and the same thing happens with the shadows on the ground when riding in the last section of the second part of this benchmark. On medium, it's less obvious with the differences compared to the ultra or high versions compared to frame generation. On the whole, on this benchmark, frame generation is okay. There is some visual loss in certain areas, and when actually playing the game, it should increase latency, which is not ideal. It seems like DLSS or FSR both without frame generation could be the way to go, but it's a balance. You'll just have to weigh it up. Monster Hunter Wilds seems like a decent upcoming game that is probably going to push your hardware a little bit. As you saw, the visual quality differences are subtle between the settings, but it is clear that if you want a higher frame rate, you are going to need some sort of upscaling. In my opinion, the quality differences between DLSS or FSR compared to the non-upscaling versions was similar, but had increased frame rates to be more playable, especially at ultra settings. Frame generation is an option, but there are some visual downsides such as lower textured quality or increased latency in the game. Given that you could be fighting monsters in an online co-op, it may be a little bit annoying to use the frame generation. When the game actually releases, I will look into this more in terms of latency tests with frame generation on. What is clear from the performance of the game is that at 1080p at 1440p on ultra settings, I was using a lot of VRAM, which could be causing performance issues. It would be more advisable to play the game at mid to high-end settings with DLSS or FSR for a more fluid experience on the RTX 3070. It's also important to consider that some of the scenes, such as in the village, are quite CPU bound. So if you're using an older CPU, you could run into some issues, even if you have a powerful GPU. Given this game is an open world game, it would be better to try and get a better CPU if you can to run the game smoothly. I wish I had some higher end hardware to test, but it is what it is. Also, in terms of hardware, for example, if I have a low CPU utilization and I have a high GPU utilization rate, then I am GPU limited. Something like this is very apparent at 1440p for my RTX 3070 in other games when I compare 1440p to 1080p. Now this example is not exactly that bad, as the GPU is doing what it should. If I have an extremely high CPU utilization rate, then it can get annoying as the GPU isn't able to output as many frames anymore. Now the benchmark still feels unoptimized, and from what I've seen online, this is the case with others as well. What's clear to me is that both the CPU and GPU are very important here. In the village, my FPS drops badly because of my CPU. There is just so much that the CPU has to calculate here. But in the plain scene, we are relying on the GPU because of the textures and lighting. At the same time, this game is open world, so it will need a decent CPU to run in general. It's no excuse for poor performance, but I hope this gets fixed before the game actually releases, but I honestly don't know. Overall, the benchmark played alright, if I can even say that. I hope there's more optimization done going forward before the game actually releases, and a less heavy reliance on upscaling to make the game more playable. One can hope that optimization comes through. That about sums it up. Check out wisec.org for some more awesome content. But other than that, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!